Welcome, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for coming. Wow, look at all these people. I can't see your faces, but I can see your names. Names I know, names I don't know. Thank you so much for taking time out of your precious day to be here. And I'm just so happy to be able to be here and share with you this history that I have been immersed in for the last 4, going on 5 years now, which I want to add is nothing compared to the amount of time that the people who were actually involved in it, some of whom are still involved in it, have dedicated. Before we begin, those of you in the United States know that today is designated Martin Luther King Day. And I'd like to take a moment to honor Dr. King, who was such a fearless and loving champion of equality and humanity for all people. So as we begin to delve into this history, it was an exciting time, a very exciting time for the people who lived it. And it's exciting to hear about now. But looking back, we can also gather the historical context, which is critically important if we want to understand where this movement and its use of acupuncture came from, as well as how it lives on and can enrich our practice today. What I want to convey to you today is, first of all, the story. What happened to create revolutionary acupuncture, and who were the people who made it happen? Second, what was the historical context, social and political context in which it happened? And third, how and why is this history relevant today? So this course is NCC AOM approved for 1 point, I believe, and we do have some course outcomes, among which are you will be able to describe the influence of the barefoot doctors of Maoist China on revolutionary acupuncture, to understand how the revolutionary acupuncture movement has evolved from 1970s era political tactics to the trauma-informed approach of community acupuncture and other groups, and to recognize the fundamental contributions of Black and Latinx acupuncturists, as well as Asian American activists to social justice acupuncture. Now, a bit of an overview, and this is based on my own research and my own work. So I posit that there have been 3 revolutionary acupuncture movements in the United States. The first took place in Harlem and the Bronx areas of New York City, and I call it revolutionary detox acupuncture from 1972 to 1982. That was immediately followed by First World acupuncture, also in Harlem from 1983 to 1984. And in the present era, we have liberation acupuncture associated with the People's Organization of Community Acupuncture. And that's based in Portland, Oregon, although it's a national and even international organization. And continuing with an overview, the story. Now, some of you may have heard some of this. You may have heard a bit more of it. You may have heard none of it. It's certainly becoming more talked about, particularly since the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis in the United States. There's a wonderful documentary, Dope is Death, by Mia Donovan, that some of you may have seen, that really gives you the political context in particular. But just to get some facts out, in 1970, the Young Lords, that was the Puerto Rican nationalist group of young people, led 2 occupations of Lincoln Hospital, which was also known as the butcher shop because it had such a terrible reputation and really gave such terrible care, in the South Bronx of New York. From 1970 to 1972, those activists who led the occupations, as well as other political revolutionaries from the left who joined them, began a heroin and methadone detoxification program at Lincoln. And it wasn't using acupuncture at first, but by 1972, they began an acupuncture detox program. But as I say, there were a lot of political revolutionaries. There was a lot of political activity. people who had been in prison for various reasons. And by 1978, the system decided it could no longer tolerate them, and they were evicted from the hospital. And by the system, I mean the city of New York, which ran the Health and Hospitals Corporation. To be clear, there was one acupuncture group led by Dr. Michael Smith, who further developed NADA, that continued, but that's not the same as the group we are talking about, the Revolutionary Detox Acupuncturists. Those people went on to form the Black Acupuncture Advisory Association of North America and opened their own college. That was raided and shut down by the FBI in 1982. But some people continued from that college. They maintained the vision and they formed a new acupuncture college, First World Acupuncture, which was focused on the right of Black and Latinx people to learn Chinese medicine and other indigenous medical traditions. Now, Revolutionary Detox Acupuncture, who actually was involved here? There were three main groups involved in two occupations of Lincoln Hospital in 1970. The first took place in July and the second in November. And when I say occupation, this was not a pacifist sit-in. There was no violence involved as it happened, but the young lords who really led the occupation in July, they were prepared to take physical action if necessary. They brought in weapons of Asian combat, nunchakus and shurikens, and they were prepared to use them if they needed to. As it happened, they didn't need to. Some of the doctors, the radical young doctors who were also politically involved, some of whom were residents there at Lincoln Hospital, helped them to gain access. Certainly not all of the doctors were on board. Some of them were definitely not, but some doctors helped them. Then we had the Health Revolutionary Unity Movement, or HRUM. And this was a group of hospital workers that formed at another of New York's municipal hospitals, Gouverneur Hospital on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And as a number of groups at that time, such as the Young Lords, such as the Black Panthers, they had a 10-point plan and they had a newspaper. And they were about community health, community control, and worker control in the hospitals and improving conditions there. And they quickly became allied with the Young Lords, and in 1969, they formed a chapter at Lincoln Hospital. And then there was Think Lincoln, which was a group of Puerto Rican and white people, professionals, non-professionals, hospital workers allied with community activists, including street gangs. And they were there solely to improve conditions at Lincoln. So one of the things they requested was a complaints table be set up in the lobby. And one of the complaints was the doctors are not available. They're taking long lunch breaks. So some of the activists went out and they located the doctors and they persuaded them to come back from their lunch breaks, and the doctors did. Now, they weren't in 1970 using acupuncture. They were using methadone tapering, which is different. But by 1972, they began to use acupuncture as a detox method. And that became the Lincoln Detox Acupuncture Collective. But where did the idea for acupuncture came from? Acupuncture was not widely used or even known about in the United States at this time. In fact, you would mainly see it, if at all, in Chinatown or East Asian communities. And even there, they tended to more use herbal medicine than acupuncture. But the background was this call for community-based healthcare in urban ghettos. And the need really arose from desperate conditions. Like you can see on the left, this is a picture of the South Bronx in the 1970s. It looks like a war zone, doesn't it? And that was what a lot of the South Bronx looked like, just devastated. And people sometimes still lived in those buildings. So oddly enough, the origins of an acupuncture solution actually began in a very different place in rural China in the early to mid 1900s. And I don't know what decade that picture on the right was taken. Obviously, these are two different environments, but they were similar in that there was a real need for a large amount of people, large populations, who had no or inadequate access to healthcare, good or any healthcare, who could arguably best be treated not by fancy, highly scientific medical techniques, but by basic primary care, which didn't have to be delivered by professionals. Now, what influenced the formation of revolutionary acupuncture, specifically at Lincoln Detox? There were a number of influences, and I'm going to focus just on the two in red at the bottom. But briefly, the other ones. As you may know, there were many leftist political movements in the 1960s, the loose amalgamation of which was known as the New Left. The old left was focused on the class struggle, but the New Left focused more on other forms of oppression, such as racism and sexism, and they championed participatory democracy and direct action. There was the opening of US-China relations, which facilitated by President Nixon's historic visit to China in 1972. Now, of course, other countries had their relations with China at this time, but in the United States, this was a very big deal. There was just tremendous interest afterwards by people in what was happening in China. Then there was the scientization of acupuncture. Funny word, but a real word. And this is something that had been occurring throughout the 20th century in China, but particularly in Mao's era, was applied to acupuncture anesthesia during surgery, which was very heavily promoted and advertised by the Chinese Communist Party as a marvelous development of them. There was also, and that led to real strong interest in the West, particularly among scientists and medical doctors, because they were using electroacupuncture. And so they saw this use of electricity and said, wow, they're using electricity. This must be scientific. Let's investigate it. So a lot of scientific research and interest began coming from the West at this point. There was also auricular acupuncture, of course, used during acupuncture detox. That, funnily enough, came from a biomedical doctor in France who developed it based on North African folk medicine that he had witnessed. And that was then picked up again by the Chinese and kind of packaged and advertised by Mao's Communist Party as another development that they had created. Then there was the counterculture that amplified interest in all things East Asian. And finally, Maoist medical diplomacy, particularly involving the barefoot doctors and the dire conditions that you saw in that picture in the South Bronx, the understanding of which, analysis of which was known as chemical warfare by political revolutionaries. Maoist medical diplomacy, from the 1950s to the mid-1970s, there were a lot of things happening in China. There was the Great Leap Forward, during which millions of Chinese people died of starvation. There was the Cultural Revolution, a very disruptive and painful time for many people in China. And there was the Sino-Soviet splits, the rupture between the USSR and China regarding the Communist Revolution, after which each power vied to lead the world revolution. And this was a time that the historian Julia Lovell called Mao's revolution in its most expansive phase. One of the key areas of expansion that China wanted to reach was Africa. Africa at this time was in a very revolutionary time itself. Many countries were throwing off the shackles of colonialism. Others were poised to do so. And China, the Chinese Communist Party, wanted to be there to help lead that revolution. So they sent a lot of resources to Africa. They sent money, they sent military aid. They brought African people to China to train them. But crucially, they also sent a lot of medical resources to African countries. This was a soft diplomacy that was very effective. And among the resources they sent were barefoot doctors, which at this time were becoming very widespread and popular, and in fact, quite effective in rural China. So for instance, the newly formed United Republic of Tanzania had barefoot doctors there. And other countries you can see there began also using TCM acupuncture, traditional Chinese medicine developed under Mao beginning in the 1950s. Now, this poster on the right was advertising a concert that was put on by the Lincoln Detox Acupuncture Collective as a benefit to raise money for the Zimbabwe African National Union. So you can see that these people who were beginning to do revolutionary detox acupuncture were well aware of what was going on in Africa. They felt connected to it. It was part of their movement. And they were aware of what was going on in China and the connection between them. Now, a word about the barefoot doctors. And it's very interesting because people I interviewed who had been involved at this time, they were all impressed by the barefoot doctors and they had very strong impressions, but their ideas of what the barefoot doctors were really varied. So I'm not looking at the chat box now, but I just like to ask everybody to think about, or you can type in the chat box if you like, what do you think of when you hear the term barefoot doctors? What words come to mind? What do you know about them? And now let's look at some facts. They were mainly young people, typically age 17 to 23, could be any age, but preferably around that age, from suitable backgrounds. And that means suitably revolutionary backgrounds. They had to be from the peasant classes and they had to have correct revolutionary thoughts. And they were trained in basic principles and techniques of both biomedicine and TCM. They were sometimes said to be armed with one silver needle and a bunch of herbs. And that evocative phrase comes from Xiaoping Fang's wonderful book, Barefoot Doctors and Western Medicine in China, which I highly recommend if you want to know more about the barefoot doctors. But as Fang points out, they were as likely to use stethoscopes and Western medicine as they were to use pulse diagnosis and herbal formulas. And indeed, one of Fang's theses is that the barefoot doctors really helped to popularize and spread biomedicine in China because they took them to the rural areas. They took it to the rural areas where it had never been available before. You could get it in urban areas, but not in the rural areas. And many people came to prefer fast-acting antibiotics, for instance, to the slower-acting herbal formulas. Another thing that Xiaoping Fang said, I interviewed him, and one of the things he said, and he also wrote in his book, is that some of the barefoot doctors told him that it was actually harder. You needed more education to be able to do Chinese medicine than you did to be able to use the biomedical techniques they were learning. So I thought that was interesting. They were also, the barefoot doctors were paraprofessionals who worked within a three-tier healthcare system, a formal system. So it was not true, as at least one American newspaper alleged, that these were uneducated peasants who were replacing doctors in China. They were actually part of this formal system. And they were trained to refer out, and they did when necessary. And they were not barefoot. They wore shoes, but they were called barefoot to ally themselves with the peasants who often did work barefoot in the fields. And indeed, for statistical purposes, the barefoot doctors were counted as peasants. So a lot of political revolutionaries and left-leaning people learned about the barefoot doctors. Some of them traveled to China and they saw the barefoot doctors in action. They didn't go there necessarily to see the barefoot doctors. They were going there to learn about the communist revolution and Maoism, which was tremendously influential. But they were influenced by the barefoot doctors. Some of them picked up booklets about them in Chinatown, put out by the People's Publishing House of China. But also within the system, there were people very much, government physicians, other physicians, academics, began visiting China as early as 1971, even before Nixon's visit. And they were very impressed by what they saw of the health reforms occurring in China, including the barefoot doctors. For instance, Victor Seidel, who was the head of social medicine at Montefiore Hospital in the Bronx, he and his wife Ruth traveled to China and they wrote a book about it. They were very impressed. Paul Dudley White was a personal cardiologist to President Eisenhower, and he wrote a piece in the New York Times. So we were beginning to get very positive reviews from people publishing in prominent journals like JAMA about the barefoot doctors in China's healthcare improvements. And it wasn't just the United States. It was also worldwide. There was this great impression. So the World Health Organization in 1978 published this groundbreaking document, the Declaration of Alma-Ata, which established health as a fundamental human right, including the people have the right and duty to participate individually and collectively in the planning and implementation of their healthcare. This was a real shift from the previous focus, which had been the West is going to lead the way with science and medicine, and everybody else will follow suit when they figure out that's the right way. So it was a very different focus, and the Barefoot Doctor Initiative is now considered one of the primary forces behind that ideological shift, leading to the Declaration of Alma-Ata. And now let's jump to the South Bronx in 1970. That photo on the left was taken by Mel Rosenthal, who was raised in a Jewish family in the South Bronx. And he returned there as an adult. He was a photographer, and he was shocked by what he saw. And he began taking photographs, particularly of children. He took a lot of photographs with children kind of playfully juxtaposed against these devastated backgrounds, although that little boy there looks more thoughtful than playful. And this is what the philosopher Marshall Berman called herbicide, or the murder of a city. And Berman said this had been happening throughout the 20th century to the South Bronx. Some of the reasons, deindustrialization was one, industry moving out, but also an absolute onslaught of roads through neighborhoods, as envisioned by Robert Moses. And Robert Moses was a master planner of New York for decades in the early middle part of the 20th century. And he was an unelected official, but he wielded tremendous power. And he loved to build roads through poor neighborhoods, which required the demolition of the existing homes. So thousands of families and communities were just, they were just moved out. They were required to go. If they tried to stay, this is what they ended up living in. There were also national policies and local policies. Benign neglect was proposed by President Nixon's advisor, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And that said, basically, if a neighborhood seems to be failing, we'll let it fail. We won't give it any aid. Planned shrinkage went a step further. It was even worse. This was a New York policy, and it said, we will identify the neighborhoods which are failing, and then we will pull the plug, the life support, from them by withdrawing municipal services, such as police callouts and fire department callouts. And this led to a phenomenon known as the burning of the Bronx, whereby 33 buildings a night were going up in flames and nobody was really going to put them out. And we know now, actually, we knew somewhat at the time, that some of those fires were set by arson, not by the people who lived in them, but by kids who had been paid to set the buildings alight, for instance, by landlords who wanted to collect insurance payout. And some scholars, in fact, specifically Deborah and Roderick Wallace, posit that this was a deliberate policy to keep Black and brown people from gaining power, which they were starting to gain some political power. Whatever the cause, it led to a massive loss of housing for poor people, white flight to the suburbs, and sometimes even poorer people moving in or staying behind and living in these buildings with absolutely no amenities. One of the things that happened was the South Bronx at this time had the highest rate of heroin addiction in the world. And the question is, why? And of course, there's some reasons here, but other parts of the world have great poverty, great suffering, and yet lower rates of heroin addiction. So why was this happening in the South Bronx? Well, people on the political left and political revolutionaries had an explanation, an analysis that they called chemical warfare. And this was an analysis among leftist thinkers and the Black Power movement. It began with leftist thinkers in the Black Power movement in the 1960s, linking heroin use to the deliberate pacification of ghetto inhabitants. And it was seen as a domestic manifestation of US imperialism and capitalism abroad. So under this analysis, the US government and pharmaceutical companies like Eli Lilly conspired to push heroin into communities like Harlem and the South Bronx to keep the people down so that they wouldn't have the willpower, the desire to rise up and do something about their situation and their oppression. And I want to add, this was not a proven theory. So this was never proven. It may sound hyperbolic now, but it gained energy from true revelations of CIA involvement in the heroin trade in Southeast Asia. I mean, the CIA was pretty deeply involved in that, which was uncovered by scholarly investigation, particularly by the historian Alfred W. McCoy, who was at Harvard at the time, and the resulting congressional hearings in the 1970s. And then this theory was conveyed in pamphlets like the Opium Trail. So that pamphlet you can see on the right, that was actually used as a primary text in the first revolutionary acupuncture college at Banna. So can you imagine going into your acupuncture classroom, and this is the first text that you're given to read? Really different kind of approach to education. Of course, they also didn't have the kind of textbooks that we have now. And the solution for the people who began revolutionary detox acupuncture was acupuncture as revolution. And here's how. East Asian modes of healing, they saw, could be used to combat not only an individual illness like heroin addiction, but a perceived state of war that happened to involve heroin and methadone addiction. And these alternative modes of healing were seen as remediation against the destructive forces of a capitalist society. Now we know that acupuncture, let's say, enables the body's will and ability to heal itself. And similarly, this can be done for unoppressed people. So this became one aspect of self-determination, supporting the goal of liberation of oppressed people. Therefore, the fight to heal individuals of an individual disease or illness was also a battle cry against capitalism and colonialism. And that is acupuncture as revolution. And it's very different than just using a technique of acupuncture, no matter how effective, to cure someone of an individual condition. So how did acupuncture come to be, specifically at Lincoln Detox? Well, it was really largely down to two men, Mutulu Shakur and Walter Bosque, who introduced it. And they were both young, very politically active men who had been involved in politics for much of their young lives, particularly Mutulu Shakur. Mutulu Shakur was a member of the Republic of New Africa, which advocated for the secession of 6 states from the United States to form a Black nation. And he was also involved with a lot of other groups. He was a great networker. He was close to the Black Panthers and the Young Lords. And so he became involved at Lincoln Detox early on when they began the methadone tapering program. Walter Bosque was a member of the Young Lords. He had begun working at Lincoln as a medical worker, and he was also interested in things like Tai Chi. So he had been to Chinatown, and he was interested in that sort of East Asian healing. They both have been involved in revolutionary politics, but as happens when people recall things, they have differing ideas, remembrances of how acupuncture came to be brought into the program. For Walter Bosque, he remembers reading newspaper articles, that they together read newspaper articles, particularly one that was based on a study done by an acupuncturist physician in Hong Kong, who was treating a patient with acupuncture anesthesia before surgery to reduce pain, and found out as kind of a side effect that the patient no longer had opium cravings. So he and another doctor began testing that on other people, and they published this study. Mutulu Shakur, on the other hand, he had 2 sons, young sons, who were severely injured in a car accident. And he was very close to Yuri Kochiyama, a prominent Japanese American activist who was close to Malcolm X. She also introduced him to other Japanese American activists who became involved with Lincoln Detox. But she took him and his sons to Chinatown, where the sons were healed through acupuncture. So that left a very big impression on him. That picture, by the way, on the right was taken by Paul Pikowitz, who was with the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars as a young academic in the early 1970s, and he traveled to China. And he was a historian, but he was able to witness, in fact, the Chinese government was keen to have him witness acupuncture anesthesia. And you can see here the patient having the surgery, and they've got the electrodes and Mao's little red book next to the machine, which was really typical. So acupuncture began at Lincoln Detox, and there was a lot of success in terms of more people began coming. They had in fact, eventually thousands of people being treated there. The word got out on the street. They were having success in what they were doing. I should add, another one of the things they were doing was political education. So they didn't just use acupuncture needles. They had readings of books, Mao's Little Red Book, Che Guevara, Frantz Fanon, other books. And they also took people in vans to the trials of political prisoners. So, and then they began also incorporating people who had been political prisoners, who had been jailed on drug charges, and those people came into the program as volunteers. So it was very successful, but there were also a lot of threats. It was quite volatile. There were threats from the political left and from the political right, both of whom didn't like what they were doing. And what happened? Well, somebody was killed. Now, the first medical director at Lincoln Detox was Franklin Apfel, and he had left partly because he had begun to fear for his life. So Richard Taft was chosen to replace him, and that is him. That's his picture on the right there. You can see he doesn't look like a typical young doctor today. He had been on the job for not too long, and he was found dead in a closet at the hospital. Died in the middle of the night. Oddly enough, there was never a formal autopsy published, but people assumed that he had been murdered. And there was reason for that. One thing was that he had received threats on his life. He had been involved in, he had expressed fear for his life. So it was assumed he was murdered. Michael Smith at this point stepped in as the director. And many of you, I'm sure, have heard of Michael Smith you will have heard of him as the architect and great promoter of NADA. And he had been also involved with political activities, let's say, to an extent. He had been involved in doing work with the Black Panthers in San Francisco. He didn't have the same political orientation as Mutulu Shakur and Walter Bosque. And he was a psychiatrist. The medical director of the program had to be an MD, so he was brought in. And he hadn't wanted actually to be involved with acupuncture, he said, because he wanted to stay away from needles. But he came in as the director. So the program continued to develop, but actually there was a real split that occurred between Michael Smith's group and Mutulu Shakur's group. So Michael Smith's group were more focused on developing this auricular technique, NADA, and using it to treat addiction. And of course, there was a lot of social stuff involved in that too. But Mutulu Shakur's group was really focused on still the liberation of people through acupuncture. And they were also using full body acupuncture and treating all kinds of conditions. And they began a semi-formal acupuncture college right there at Lincoln Detox, collaborating with a father-son duo from Montreal, Oscar and Mario Wexu, who had their own disagreements with the medical establishment. So as I mentioned earlier, the situation couldn't last for too long. The city of New York, the Health and Hospital Corporation, decided it had had enough. I mentioned there were a lot of political revolutionaries. There were people who had been in jail and prison coming through. There were a lot of people on the payroll that the city wasn't used to, and who knows everything that was going on, but there was a lot of stuff fermenting. Also, just using acupuncture, not the kind of thing they were used to. So in November 1978, the mayor of New York ordered that Mutulu Shakur's group be evicted from the hospital. The doors were chained shut. Patients were told to go elsewhere. Actually, they were told to go to Michael Smith's group. The employees of Shakur's group were either sent to far-flung hospitals where they couldn't work together, or they were fired. And at this point, Michael Smith's branch was renamed the Substance Abuse Division of the Department of Psychiatry, or still known as Lincoln Detox. And they continued there, but Mutulu Shakur's group did not. And they went on to form the Black Acupuncture Advisory Association of North America. They bought this beautiful building in Harlem. That's the location today, although of course there's no acupuncture college there right now. It was on a street called the Strivers Row in Harlem, New York. And they set up a formal college and clinic there. And their purpose was to train and serve Black and Latinx people and communities using traditional Chinese medicine. So So they were using auricular acupuncture, they were using full body acupuncture, they were learning the theories of Chinese medicine. They were really taken up with the whole thing, but their underlying aim was still liberation of oppressed peoples. And there were also a lot of different political groups, politically revolutionary groups that got involved there. So quite dramatically, in 1982, Bana was raided by the FBI, and really the movement was crushed by the FBI and something called the Joint Terrorist Task Force, which set out to really crush all remaining leftist political movements, anything they consider terrorism hanging over from the 1960s and 70s. Now, the catalyst was a robbery of an armed Brinks truck. The Brinks trucks are those armored vehicles that take big stacks of cash from businesses to banks. And this had occurred in October 1981. 2 policemen and a security guard were killed. So it was a really big deal. And that robbery was in connection with political activities, revolutionary political activities. Some people at Bana were implicated. A little bit more background, though. The FBI had a program called COINTELPRO, for counterintelligence program, which for decades had been targeting left-wing and Black movements, political movements. They targeted not just the ones that were potentially violent, but also Martin Luther King. So Bana had been on their radar or under surveillance by them for a while. I should say COINTELPRO was underhanded. It used what you might politely call dirty tactics, sometimes illegal probably. So there was stuff going on both sides, but the school was closed down. Some people were imprisoned, or I should say jailed, for refusing to testify before a grand jury. And Mutulu Shakur actually went underground for 4 years. So the members were dispersed, the movement was crushed. But not long after, there were some people who remained, and they held on to this vision of acupuncture serving these communities in a revolutionary way. So they began their own college, the Institute of Traditional Chinese Medicine in New York City, commonly known as First World Acupuncture. And this was also in Harlem, different location, but still in Harlem. And they call themselves First World to distinguish themselves from this derogatory notion of Third World. Third world people in the US have been forced to accept humiliation, experimentation, sterilization, surgical and chemical abuse by the US healthcare system and its institutions. We use the term first world to honor the ancient practices and development of the cultures in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. That's from their college catalog. And here also from their college catalog is their goals. I won't read the whole thing. You can have a look at this yourself. But I will point out, at the end, they say, we support the human right of all people to choose and control their health care, and the human right of all oppressed people, in particular Black and Latino people, to be trained in acupuncture and other forms of traditional medicine. And they were still focused, you can see, on addiction as well, treating addiction as what they call chemical genocide. So what was First World Acupuncture about? They wanted to maintain the vision and praxis of revolutionary detox acupuncture, but without the political engagement, which was no longer tenable at this time. There was no way you could continue with that. And they were focused on those themes I just mentioned: health and care as a human right, and the right of Black and Latinx people to learn these medicines. To me, they were primarily revolutionary for their model of acupuncture education. They were the first college to proclaim service to the community as its mission and vision. And so far as I know, the only college to proclaim that until Pocatec came along. And they had this clinic that offered low-cost, low-tech healing, especially for people whose health problems stem from social or racial inequities. And we see that today still in some of the many college clinics in the United States, and particularly those offsite clinics that serve under-resourced, underserved communities. And I'd be really interested from people we have so many people from outside the United States. Do you have those kinds of things at your acupuncture colleges where you are from? So let's jump into the present with liberation acupuncture, which is the guiding philosophy of the People's Organization of Community Acupuncture, based in Portland, Oregon. And you can see here on the left, that is Mutulu Shakur. And on the right here, bottom right, that's Michael Smith, which are two of their spiritual ancestors, along with others from inside the acupuncture community and outside of it. And what makes liberation acupuncture revolutionary? Well, their community acupuncture model of low-price treatments in a group setting was partly inspired by the model set by the revolutionary detox acupuncture movement. The People's Organization of Community Acupuncture takes moral inspiration from some founders of that movement here. And it also echoes concepts of liberation theology and liberation psychology as evinced by Gustavo Gutierrez and Ignacio Martín Baró, but also of the Black liberation movement, which inspired revolutionary detox acupuncture. And some other key points of commonality. Liberation acupuncture sees healthcare as a human right, the centrality of healthcare as a human right. And that disease can only be understood in the context of socioeconomic forces. And it emphasizes priorities of people who have been oppressed, exploited, or traumatized by society, as well as it's motivated by a fundamental disagreement with racial and social inequities. And it views acupuncture as a means to promote and engender social change. The word about revolutionary acupuncture and education. You can only have a lineage if you have a way of passing on the teaching. So it's notable that all three of these movements had their own acupuncture college. First, there was BANA, they had the Harlem Institute of Acupuncture, the first US acupuncture college designed to train and serve Black and Latinx people. And then there was First World Acupuncture, the first US acupuncture college to offer a traditional acupuncturist in service to the community degree, actually the only US acupuncture college to offer that degree. And wouldn't you, I would be so proud to have that degree hanging on my wall. And then there's Pocatec, the first US acupuncture college designed to train community acupuncturists, and the only one to do so. And you can see here that picture, that is from the outside of Working Class Acupuncture, the flagship clinic of POCA, and their logo, their acupuncture can change the world, with the heart channel highlighted. We also have what I would call an expanded lineage of social justice acupuncture, acupuncture used in the context of social justice. And we have national and international organizations, including AWB, Acupuncturists Without Borders, NADA, the Puerto Rican group, Proyecto Salud y Acupuntura para el Pueblo, and others. And we have local institutions such as the Acupuncture Detox Specialist Collective, the African Holistic Health Association in Washington, D.C., begun by, I believe, by Kokai Patterson, who was one of the people who worked at the revolutionary detox acupuncture with Mutulu Shakur, and then later worked with Michael Smith at Lincoln Detox. There's Hooper Detox in Portland, Oregon, run by David Eisen, who also worked with Michael Smith at Lincoln Detox. There are individuals, including people who came out of Lincoln, BANA, and First World Acupuncture, who have gone on to practice acupuncture very much in a social justice context and in a really unheralded way, but they're just doing it in the ground, in the dirt, as one of them said to me. And some of those people actually went on to become very immersed in HIV/AIDS related work beginning in the 1980s. And there's a number of other organizations, acupuncture organizations, that have gone on to do that, including the AIDS Care Project and the Pan-African Acupuncture Project, which I believe has been on hold since COVID began. But we'd be really interested when we end to hear from some of you about other organizations that you have been involved with or are involved in. So finally, and that's about the end of my brief history of revolutionary acupuncture. The book, if you would like to read the full story, is on discount price through January 31st. And so it is just $2.99 in whatever one of these currencies you're using. And it's available through, and this is the ebook, by the way. So it's available through all your major ebook suppliers, whether you use Kobo, Kindle, Nook, Apple. I can't think of others. There's probably others out there as well. And finally, thank you so much for coming and spending some of your precious day to come here and listen to me. And I'm going to see if I can look at the chat now, because I have been not looking at the chat because I didn't want to get distracted. So I'm looking at the chat now. And let's see, Northern College of Acupuncture in York has community multi-bed teaching clinics. Ford administration, oh, thanks. Also wanted, let me see if I can make this larger. I don't know if you're seeing the chat as I'm seeing the chat, but I'm just looking at what people said. Ford administration also wanted to addict people to methadone as a tool of control. Yeah, so what Elaine is saying there, that's really interesting, because I didn't bring that up, but methadone was replacing one form of addiction with another. And Michael Smith actually wrote there was another movement. So there's another movement called Science for the People that was happening at the time. And they had a journal called Science for the People, which has recently been revived. And Michael Smith wrote this really devastating piece about methadone addiction and how it was approved as the best treatment for heroin addiction. But essentially, you had the pharmaceutical companies. He was really pointing the finger at Eli Lilly. But it was replacing this one addiction with another. And there were definitely problems with that. For instance, people were being, they were being controlled through being given their methadone. So once you were put on methadone, and people were told, well, you can go to prison or you can be on methadone. So some people chose to go to prison, but others chose to be on methadone. So they would have to go pick up their dose. And when they went to pick up their dose, they would be told things like, well, you're wearing a politically revolutionary button, so you can't have your methadone. Or it was also alleged that they were sent out to go they weren't given their methadone until they would sort of spy on other political activists and come back and say what was going on. So there was, yeah, that's a very good point about the methadone. And there was a real backlash against that. And let's see, Ralph, you're saying that just came from a NADA training for psychiatric nurses and social workers. Great. That's really interesting. And if anybody would like to ask questions, by the way, any questions, comments? I should maybe add a word too about, just to follow up, because when you see a movie, and I think probably if you see Dope is Death, when you see a documentary, there's a bit at the end about where are they now? What's happened to people now? So I'll just add, Walter Bosque is still involved in acupuncture. I think he's working with AWB. He's working with Puerto Salud y Acupuntura. I think he's working on a book of his own, actually. Mutulu Shakur is still in prison, and he's been there for the last 35 years. And despite the fact that he is 70 or possibly older now, and he's had COVID and he's in late stage cancer, and he's been denied parole multiple times. So that's other people out there quietly doing acupuncture in their own way. Oh, Beth is asking, what were my motivations in researching this time in acupuncture's history? Well, yeah, interesting you say. So Beth, it's actually an interesting story. I heard about it, maybe not in the way that other people might have. I was doing an interview for a position that I didn't get, but during this interview, the person interviewing me mentioned that they had trained, and this was somebody who's a researcher and has an MPH, but they had trained as an acupuncturist at First World Acupuncture. And they just mentioned it. And so I said, oh, tell me more about that. And they told me a little bit, and I got very interested. And I thought, even at the time that I was having that interview, I thought, maybe I won't get this position, but I think I'm going to write a book about this. And I did. And as it happened, just at that time, people have been becoming, maybe it was in the zeitgeist, people becoming very interested in this topic for a multitude of reasons. So it's an important history. I think there's a lot of looking back at history and saying, why did we tell it that way? Why didn't we know about this? And so now we're starting to hear some of the things we weren't hearing about before. Well, thanks everyone so much again for being here.